Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is Chantel, and today in my weekly book video I would like to do a little bit of a discussion of the Masquerade series by Seth Dickinson, otherwise known as the Cormorant series. So this series of novels begins with the Traitor Cormorant and also includes the Monster Cormorant and the Tyrant Cormorant. I have read all three of these books, and I wanted to talk in a little bit more depth about them. I especially want to talk a little bit about Dickinson's world building and the way that he constructs the empire in this book, the Empire of Fallcrest, aka the Masquerade itself, because I think it's particularly interesting and a little bit unique compared to a lot of the other kinds of fictionalized empires that I have read about sort of in recent years, in I guess what I would call the sort of subgenre of the anti-colonialist contemporary fantasy series, right? A fantasy, a kind of speculative fiction that is rooted in anti-colonialist politics that I've read a lot of, and I think that Dickinson's series is a particularly interesting and in some ways unique kind of example of that subgenre. And so I want to talk about that in this video a little bit. So I am going to give a sort of blanket spoiler warning, as I do in most of these sort of more in-depth discussion videos. If you want the sort of my sort of non-spoilery opinions about these books, you can watch the reading wrap-ups that I've done where I talked about these. That's where I am, keeping a lid on any potential spoilers. This kind of video, I kind of put a blanket spoiler warning on, just so that I can feel more comfortable sort of talking freely about potentially more detailed things about the book and events in the book and characters and just the books in general. So if you are worried about spoilers, go read the books first, then come back and watch this video. I am not necessarily doing this to review the books, to tell you whether you should read them or not. I will just say on the top of this video that I like these books, and I considered them worth my time. I had a good time with them. I enjoyed them. If a fourth one comes out, if or when the fourth one comes out, I will certainly read it. And yeah, I think that Seth Dickinson is a great writer. Again, I've said this in my wrap-ups. So if you want to know whether you should read the books or not, I think, yes, if you like that kind of thing, yes, you should. But this is more of a discussion of some of the aspects of the books that I thought were particularly interesting. So that's what I'm doing here today. So that having been said, spoiler warning given, from this point forward, I am not going to censor myself in terms of talking about things that happen in these books. One of the things that I consistently found really interesting and unique in these books, in the Cormorant books, was how the Empire of Fallcrest is actually treated and what kind of empire it is. Let me give you an example. I would say most of the sort of anti-colonialist fantasy books that I have read tend to focus on empires that explicitly utilize violence and violent conquest in order to expand themselves, right? In order to expand their reach. And certainly Fallcrest does use violence. I think all empires use violence in one form or another to expand themselves, to spread their hegemony, to exert control over colonized peoples. I think that is pretty universally true. But I think that what Dickinson is doing, Dickinson's conception of empire is, to some extent, I think, more modern than some of the others that I've read, in the sense that Fallcrest uses a lot more economic pressure and trade pressure in order to expand its borders and its hegemony. And I think particularly in the use of eugenics, which I found absolutely fascinating in these books. Fallcrest's entire sort of moral and ethical center is, at its heart, a eugenicist project. It's a project that is talked about in terms of hygiene, racial hygiene, and, birth programs, and the study of genetics. Again, this is what eugenics is, right? It's the study of genetics for the purposes of somehow creating a kind of better version of humanity, right? And that to me felt so modern, right? It felt very rooted in what has come to be understood as a very 20th century version of empire, right? It's a kind of situation that is based very much in late 19th through mid 20th century use of scientific progress for political ends, right? And it's, in a lot of ways, a very American kind of empire, right? To me, as I was reading this series, I pretty consistently felt like the empire in these books, it felt very Anglo-American to me. And the eugenicist policies of this empire specifically felt very American to me. And I was actually kind of gratified when I read the sort of acknowledgments at the end of the third book, where Seth Dickinson says, in fact, that yes, he did in fact base this on American eugenics policies, because yes, for a very long time, the United States had many very eugenicist policies. In fact, the Nazis made it very clear that they based many of their eugenicist policies on what we had been doing in the United States for decades. It's very insidious, and it's a kind of evil genius that tends to hide itself and couch itself in language about progress and science and civilization and, again, cleanliness and hygiene, which is often, I think, a very effective way of hiding itself. And I really appreciate Dickinson playing with these ideas, because I feel like I haven't read very many authors who have done similar things in recent years, right? I feel like it's not something that's being talked about or dealt with much in a lot of the fiction that I've read. I feel like Dickinson's kind of unique in that way. So I have really enjoyed that a lot about Dickinson's writing, and also the way in which he is very willing to problematize, I suppose, our sort of traditional ideas about scientific progress and scientific knowledge, right? Because, of course, there is always a dark side to that kind of progress, right? And in the books, it's talked about a lot, right? There's a lot of of good things that the Masquerade does, that the Empire does in the Borrowed Cormorant books. They bring inoculations to populations that had never had inoculations before, right? They have a lot of medical technology and medical knowledge that is very helpful in terms of, containing the spread of disease, potentially. They understand how disease spreads in order so that they can potentially stop it from spreading if they need to. They do have a lot of good things, right? Like, they understand that, like, you need to have clean water to prevent the spread of things like cholera and dysentery. And they certainly are spreading that knowledge around this world in the context of these books, right? And when they talk about hygiene, sometimes they literally are just talking about, like, having clean water and keeping yourself clean, washing your hands before you eat, or, having sterile instruments before you do a medical procedure on somebody, that kind of thing. Which is all, it's like, yes, they know this, and they have this knowledge that some of these other, like, groups of people that they are colonizing don't yet have or don't yet quite understand, and they are bringing that knowledge to some of those groups, and that's acknowledged within the books by characters in the books, even characters who really, really don't like the Empire and what it's doing and its overall project. Many characters, including Baru herself, are willing to admit that, like, there are good things, there's important knowledge that these people have acquired, and that they are bringing to the people they're interacting with, even when they're also interacting with them in very violent, very colonialist ways. But there is a dark side to this idea of scientific progress, right? And that is the eugenics of it all, right? That is the eugenics of it all. That is the idea that if someone is queer, that they should be sterilized, for instance, or if someone is neurodivergent, they should be sterilized, or if someone is just of the wrong racial phenotype or something like that, that they can or should be sterilized, or that we can somehow craft a perfect humanity that is free from weakness and free from disease. Maybe that sounds good on paper, but what it means in practice is that a lot of innocent people who maybe don't fit that very narrow definition of humanity are now going to be dehumanized, and they're going to be treated by the state as people who, as non-people sometimes, and violence is going to be done to them, right? And that is demonstrably in, relatively recent human history, that has demonstrably been true of this idea of scientific progress, right? Across multiple different vectors. And of course, there's also the weapons of mass destruction of it all. And it is interesting to me that, sort of in response to the weapons of mass destruction that the Empire has developed, these guns and things, and the fire that burns even when you throw water on it and things like that, in response, what we end up with is the Cancrioth, which is literally a cancer that is deliberately implanted in people, and they are willing to use this horrible, horrible disease that comes from their homeland called the kettling as a biological weapon, right? They're potentially thinking of using the kettling as a biological weapon, and we see it happen on this small island, and they're considering bringing it sort of to the mainland where it will spread and cause, innumerable damage in order to overthrow the Empire. And that, I think, is a really interesting counterpoint to this sort of the scientifically developed weapons of mass destruction that the Empire has, right? And so I find all of that really interesting and unique about this. And again, like the suppression of queerness in the Empire, which is sort of understood in the context of Dickinson's books as kind of a holdover from the sort of pre-revolutionary world where this, that this empire rose out of, where when back in the day when they had an aristocracy and they had a monarchy, before they overthrew it, it seems to be tied to that, where like it was one aspect of the perceived decadence of the old aristocracy and the old royalty, that they engaged in homosexuality, in queer sex and queer behavior, as part of that sort of overweening decadence. And so that was when they overthrew the aristocracy and overthrew the royalty. That is why there is kind of a cultural taboo against homosexuality, but they have enveloped it, they have encased it within this language of hygiene and eugenics, and they use all the same kinds of arguments against queerness that some actual right-wing people in the present day would say, well, if everybody was like you, then we just, humanity would just die out, and things like that. And aren't, don't you feel so selfish because, if you're not procreating, then humanity could die out or something like that. It's wild to me. And and Dickinson utilizes this very effectively in his books. So I really enjoyed that as well. But yeah, so to me, the whole thing feels very modern in a way that a lot of anti-colonialist speculative fiction these days doesn't feel quite so modern. And maybe I'm just reading the wrong stuff. I certainly do not claim a kind of holistic knowledge of the entire subgenre. I feel like I've read some of the the major titles in the subgenre, but certainly I don't know all of it. So there's probably titles that I'm missing. But yeah, that is one of the reasons why I liked this series so much, apart from the character of Baru herself, who is absolutely fascinating. And yeah, I love what Dickinson is doing with the concept of empire here. And I did just kind of want to talk a little bit about the Americanness of it all, especially because I've been kind of reading some nonfiction works of history lately that have been sort of driving home to me the fact of America as an empire itself, right? The United States, the country that I live in, we are an empire, and we don't like to think about or talk about ourselves in terms of empire, but we certainly exercise a lot of imperial control over the rest of the world, or traditionally have. And I really, that's probably why like these connections have stuck out to me so strongly in Dickinson's books, just because it's kind of something that's been on my brain anyway lately, and what I've been thinking about lately. But there's this passage from the Tyrant Baru Cormorant that I think really illustrates like what my line of thinking has been recently about the United States as an empire. And so I just kind of wanted to read it because I think it was pretty trenchant. So it goes like this. Yes, people had always been evil nearly as much as they had been good. Yes, happiness was rarer than suffering. That was simply a fact of mathematics. Happiness required a narrow range of conditions, and suffering flourished in all the rest. But Falcrest was not an innocent victim of a historical inevitability. Empire required a will, a brain to move the beast, to reach out with appetite, to see other people as the answer to that appetite, to justify the devouring of other peoples as right and necessary and good, to frame slavery and conquest as acts of grace and charity. Encrasticism had provided that last and most fateful technology, the capability to justify any violence in the name of an ultimate destiny, an engine to inflict misery and to claim that misery as necessity in the quest for utopia, a false science by which the races and sexes could be separated and specialized like workers in a mill, and the endless, self-deceptive, blind, guilty quest to justify that false science so that the suffering and the misery remained necessary. Falcrest had chosen empire. Falcrest could, therefore, be held responsible for its choice. Not all those who lived in Falcrest participated in its devourings, but all those who lived in Falcrest had benefited from them, and by encouragement or by passive acceptance, they had allowed those devourings to continue. And that, to me, is really, first and foremost, I think this is incredibly well written. I think Dickinson is a great writer. And also, yeah, again, I think that really struck home to me as being just so relevant to the world and to the United States' place in the world specifically, that, you know, I don't think it can possibly be a coincidence, first of all. But also, yeah, the idea that, like, there's some grand inevitable destiny, right? It brings to mind, for me at least, the manifest destiny of, you know, the concept that we have in the United States of, well, we were destined as a people to spread out all across the continent from coast to coast, you know? And the way in which we use that to elide, for instance, the genocide of indigenous peoples, right? And the way in which we use, you know, language like, well, we have to bring these people democracy. We have to help rid them of their own tyrannical leadership. We have to bring civilization to them. We have to bring, you know, we have to bring our superior technology to these places that are impoverished in the world while eliding the fact that we've often been responsible for impoverishing them in the first place, and that we're really just using this anyway as a justification to, you know, claim their natural resources or whatever. So yeah, that is what I kind of had to say about the Masquerade series, the Borrowed Cormorant series that I recently read. I really liked it. I think it's very good. I think the character work is excellent, and the plotting is excellent. And as I just discussed at length, I think the world building is also quite good. So that is what I have to talk about today. Let me know in the comments below what you thought of these books, if you agree with me. Again, please be kind. Don't be a jerk. Like this video if you liked it, subscribe if you want to see more, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye.